secret stuff in the Mormon church as well. So if you are a member of the church, that's fine. But then you can be a more advanced member. And so if you follow all the rules all the time, you can be a temple-going Mormon. And you have to have a temple recommend. And Mormons don't believe they can go to the highest level of heaven unless they have a temple recommend. And then you can go to the Mormon temple and practice the ordinances, right? And so you get blessed and anointed, and they have these rituals they perform where you're blessed and anointed to become a god someday. And they have endowments where you learn the secret signs and passwords and handshakes to get into heaven. Because after you die, you're going to go to the veil, and you're going to have to present yourself at the veil, and you're going to have to give the secret signs and tokens to the angel at the veil so that you'll be admitted to heaven, signs and tokens that you learn in the temple. They give you a secret temple name that you're not allowed to share with anyone, and then you have to give that as well after you die. So, I mean, they're very, very secret-y, kind of for a very large religion. There's a lot of good things about being in the Mormon church and in the Mormon community. There is a large community. They tend to be family-oriented. They have like really belonging in the community. So church is long, right? It's 3 hours on Sunday, and then you have other meetings during the week, and you have cultural activities and gatherings all the time, and everybody has large families, and there's a lot of good that comes from that. Mormons tend to be high achieving, highly educated,
extremely hardworking.
They have a reputation for being very kind and open. And there's a lot of bad that comes from that as well. Mormon youth have a really high suicide rate. And you're constantly driven at to be perfect, to be pure, to be right. And so every once in a while you'll get in the news that some young man kills himself because he's been masturbating and he doesn't feel like he can control it. And so there's no way out. He can never be okay. And so he kills himself. Or you find in the homosexual community, you're taught that being homosexual is a sin, you have same-sex attraction, and you can't beat it. You feel like if I pray, God will help me. If I pray, God will help me, and I can't beat it. And they end up either leaving somehow and having this transition out, or they end up killing themselves. And they're getting better at the church at addressing some of these issues, but it's still very, very painful for people that leave. My wife had a very different experience than I did in Mormonism because I was a boy and she was a girl. And Mormonism is a very patriarchal society. There's God, man, woman, right? The man talks to God for the woman. Women can have leadership roles in the church, but only be in charge of other women and children. There's always a man in charge. And this bothered her. I don't know. And as a kid, when she was growing up, she felt left out all the time because the boys got cool things. They got to go on scouting outings. They go out into the woods and toast marshmallows and camp. And she had to learn to make bread and it's like chant. Do you remember the Young Women's oath still?
Yes.
What is it?
It's long. We are daughters of our Heavenly Father who loves us, and we love Him. We will stand as witnesses of God at all times, in all things, in all places, as we live the young women values, which are faith, divine nature, individual worth, knowledge, choice, and accountability. We believe as we come to and accept upon these responsibility, we will be prepared to make and keep sacred covenants, receive the ordinances of the temple, and enjoy the blessings of exaltation. Repeat that at every meeting.
And so, it's not quite the same. But lots of guilt. Like people say Catholics have like a monopoly on guilt, but it's not true. And so Mormons push really big. Evangelical Christians talk a lot about being saved and about Jesus, and like Jesus is going to let us go to heaven. You know, He died for us. He saved us, and I've accepted Jesus as my personal Savior, and so I'm saved. And Mormons don't really have that. They believe that they make errors and that they can repent for it through personal atonement, which is usually as simple as admitting fault and not doing it again. or going and talking to your ecclesiastical leader. It's like halfway between personal penance and confession. You have to go talk to your leader, and they're really big on sexual purity. It's another issue about being a girl in the church. If you have impure thoughts, you're supposed to go talk to an old man about it. It's again, so there's good and bad. But as far as us leaving, so I would define myself before leaving as very, very Mormon, like extremely Mormon. Like read the Book of Mormon all the time. I've read it dozens of times. I used to have it almost memorized. I read the Bible. I was very, very keen on prayer and going to church, and I didn't. It wasn't as social for me as it was kind of an obligation as well. Growing up, it was what you had to do, and I remember thinking back to like, well, what was I going to do when I was a teenager, when I was in high school, and I was like going to join the Marine Corps. I was going to do all this stuff, and I figured out one day, I was like, oh, well, what do I need to do to be happy in life? Well, I figured what I need to do to be happy is I have to do all the stuff the church says. And that was like a big decision for me. I'm going to have to do what the church says, and I'm going to get married, and I'm going to have kids, and it's going to be this great thing, and that's what I've got to do. And that kind of locked me on as well. And I served in an LDS mission, and I went to Brazil, and I lived there for 2 years and taught people about the right Jesus, right? And they'd be like, we have Jesus, and I'd say, well, no, that's the wrong Jesus. And I didn't say that. I didn't say your God is wrong, but I did. I did say that, just gently, and tried to explain to them that the Book of Mormon was true, and we talk about the vision of Jesus, or Joseph Smith, when he saw God the Father and God the Son. Or we read from the Book of Mormon, we have people pray, and then tell them, well, how do you feel when you pray? They're like, oh, I felt nice. And we're like, well, that's God telling you. You felt nice when you prayed, so God's telling you that this is true. That the Book of Mormon is true, and that Joseph Smith did restore the gospel in modern time. So that's what's going on. And taught people and baptized them and made them members of the Mormon Church. Got married in a secret temple ceremony to Christy when I was 22 years old. And we went to church. We took our kids to church. Our kids sang songs. We shared faith-promoting stories. It was very, very Mormon. And Christy is different from me. Christy asks why. She wants to understand things. When something bothers her, she wants to find out. And she would bug me about things about the church. And because I made it such a part of my life for so long and done so much within Mormon church study, I felt like I had answers. And usually I did. Or she would complain about something in the church, and I'd give her some right answer, right? And I was in the Army National Guard, and I got sent to Iraq in 2003. And while I was in Iraq, my brother's wife, who was not LDS, talked to Christy one day about Mormon temple ceremonies and explained that a lot of the Mormon temple ceremony had been derived from the Masonic secret rites. And Christy asked me about that. And I was like, I don't know, I'll find out. So I did. I looked around until I found an answer that I felt explained it. And that was just that, well, you know what, there was a temple in Jerusalem, and there were Knights Templar that had gone over there, and they learned some stuff that was temple. And so I'm saying that the Mormon temple rites, the Masonic rites, really, are taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Or they'd been revealed partially from God to people. People that had the light of Christ upon them could receive some truth, and it had just been corrupted over time. And so the Masonic rites, the true rites, but they've changed with time and been lost. And they're not right anymore, quite. And Joseph Smith fixed it, because God told him to. And so the Mormon temple ceremony is the true rite ceremony. And somehow I believed that that's what they used to do in the temple in Jerusalem, was these weird washings and anointings and weird handshakes and stuff. But, yeah. Anyway, I found that answer. But in doing that, I'd found other things that had bothered me. And because I was at war, I was either scared for my life or I had lots of time to read and to think. And interestingly enough, I had internet access. And so then later I came back and started looking at other issues. Things that I'd even been exposed to before about multiple versions of the first vision. Like Joseph Smith's mother wrote down that when Joseph Smith had his first vision that he'd seen an angel. And that went in her journal. And I'd seen that before, and I was just like, whatever, I can't deal with it now. And I actually had a pamphlet someone well-meaning person had given me, and I tore it up and threw it away. And I was like, I can't worry about that right now. I'm in Brazil, I'm on a mission, and whatever, it doesn't matter, because I know it's right. And came back to some of these and learned more about that. And then I stumbled on the Book of Abraham. And so Book of Abraham, when Joseph Smith was in Nauvoo, somebody came through that had a mummy display, because these things used to be popular. Like, you go over to Egypt, you loot the tombs, you take the mummies out, you drag them around, and people pay money to see them. Right? And so this guy had 6 mummies and some papyrus scrolls that he was showing around. And members of the church were like, hey, we have a prophet. He can read this stuff. Because they're like, nobody can read Egyptian. Right? It's mysterious and strange. Like, our prophet can do it. And so they got together and they bought his whole display. They bought his mummies and his papyrus and gave it to Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith did not translate it like he did the Book of Mormon. He didn't just sit there and tell someone what it said with his face in the hat. He sat down and he worked out meanings for the symbols. And he wrote them down very meticulously. So he'd take an Egyptian symbol, and he thought that each symbol was like a sentence. And so he'd write down that symbol in his notes, and he would write out what it meant. And he did this for the Book of Abraham. And he took a funerary text, the Book of Breathings, and he interpreted it to be a lost text that Abraham had written while he was in Egypt. And it's a story of the creation of the world. It's a rewrite of Genesis. That Joseph said that Abraham wrote with his own hand on papyrus. And he took, there's that seal that goes behind the person's head when they embalm him and put him in the casket. He had one of those seals, and he interpreted it to be the universe. And he's like, here's God in the center, and this is the star Kolob that he lives by, and here's the sun. And he's written all this meaning into this thing. That's a charm to protect the dead person, right? And this whole thing, this whole Book of Abraham, and it was really, really odd that there's this wealth of evidence that he just totally made up all this stuff, right? And you have the pictures. And when the Mormon Church, those papyrus were lost. The Mormon Church broke apart, and then later they were found again, and they were purchased by the Mormon Church in Utah from the Reorganized Church, which was one of the big chunks that stayed behind when the Mormons went west. That's where Emma Smith stayed and her kids. And they're now called the Community of Christ. But in any case, they bought this stuff from them. And then they printed them in full color in the 60s. Yes. And then people came back and looked at it and were like, that's not what that is.
Yeah, it's really obvious.
Everybody knows anything about Egyptology knows what this is. And so now, because I grew up reading the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, which used to be called the Book of Commandments, they're the revelations that Joseph Smith received after the church was formed, and they all got documented. And I'd read those, and I'd read the Pearl of Great Price, which is the Book of Abraham, and then a retranslation that Joseph Smith made of the Book of Moses, which is another creation version, right? And I was very familiar with the Egyptian hieroglyphics, wrong. And so now whenever I see Egyptian hieroglyphics, I think of the Book of Abraham and the Mormon Church. It's just, some of that stuff became weird. And so me personally, I'm finding all this stuff, and I'm reasonably smart. And so I would find really weird ways for stuff to still be right. And I read that Brigham Young said this. Brigham Young said that if a white woman gets pregnant by a black man, that the only way for them to go to heaven is if you kill them and spill their blood onto the dirt. Because their sin is so great that it can only be atoned for by blood sacrifice. Right? And I'd be like, oh, okay. Brigham Young also said that Adam is God the Father, and he's our only God. And so I'd be like, oh, well, that's fine, that's easy, because, Adam, because we're all going to become gods, the good Mormons anyway. So I hope to be a good Mormon someday, and I'll become a god. And Adam's the first man, and he's a god now, and so he's going to help judge us, and we're going to have to go through him to get to the big head god, right? So I'm like, okay, that's fine, that works. And just what we call mental gymnastics, trying to make things fit, and after a while it became overwhelming. And I would talk about this with Christy all the time. Like, well, there's this, and there's this. And she loves to understand things anyway. But I still, and one day I was like, well, it was getting exhausting, trying to make everything still fit, because there's so much we could talk for days. And I was like, well, okay, the thing that it comes down to, the very thing that got me started at the beginning is like, how do I feel about this? Why do I believe it's true? Why am I going to this effort? It was because it's how I feel when I pray. And so let's do an experiment. And so I prayed to something not God. I was like, I'm going to pray to that rock right there. I'm going to pray to Christy that's in Utah while I'm out here in Iraq.
As you should.
I'm going to pray to the Virgin Mary. And I start running these experiments in, and I have the same emotional response when I'm praying to the rock that I do when I pray to God or when I'm singing music in church. It's the same emotional response. I'm like, oh, this is what I've been taught, and what I have taught other people to do is to associate with God confirming truth. And so then if that's true, God's confirming that it's right to pray to the rock. And I was like, oh, I can let it all go. And it was so weird to me that it's such a switch after so much effort and so much time that there's this kind of the switch you can finally throw in the end and be like, oh, I'm going to let go. And then I told her, and she's like, what? Like, Christy Goodroo, it's not true. She's like, what is wrong with you? I'm like, what do you mean? You've been bugging me for years about this stuff. And you're like, I don't want to go to church. It's a pain. Or why is this? Why is the church like this? Why does it treat women like this? Why? And I'm like, I thought you'd be happy. She's like, no, you're crazy. You can't just say it's not true. You can't not do it. And so that became a big thing. And then she ended up having to do all her own research. And some things that were a bigger deal for me weren't for her, right? So like the Book of Abraham, or even the Kinderhook plates, which I didn't mention before. Joseph Smith, when that the Mormons got kicked out of independence, they built a legion. They were going to go out and free them, and it ended up not happening. And while they were out, he somebody pointed out and said, oh, there's an Indian burial site over there. And he went up there and dug it up. He found a skull and some old plates. And they were brass, and they looked old and aged. And he explained that the skull had belonged to a white Yemenite named Elf, and that he'd written this record, and that maybe he'd translate it someday, and it's scratched onto these plates. And then other people later came out and said, oh, dude, we did that to play a joke on him. we got these plates, and we cut them out. They look kind of weird, and scratched some marks into them, and it set him up to see what would happen. It was a joke, right? And the Mormon churches had the plates tested at one point. Somebody came in, a metallurgist, and measured them and looked at them. And they're like, yeah, this is totally 19th century world bronze. There's nothing else it could be. But it's things like this. They kind of...
Sorry. The language you used a second ago, I'm intrigued by. You said, if God wanted me to pray to the rock. Was that just a contradiction and you thought that was funny, therefore not true? Or was that an important step for you that God was in, at that state where you believed in God, God was now giving you permission to pray to the rock?
No, that was not a step.
And that was a relief.
Yeah, so no, that was making a point that, because as a Mormon, you're taught the Mormon church is true and the Mormon church is false. And I looked at the early history in the Mormon church,
yeah,
and then I couldn't find a difference between it and any other church that I'd always known was wrong.
Sure.
Right? And so if I look at like the Branch Davidians, they had the compound in Texas, David Koresh, charismatic leader, they got all these people, the guns, he had all sorts of kids with different women, and it ended up going up in flames. At the end, after they released most of the children, they went down and executed all of David's children, or the ones they didn't release, shot them in the head, and set it on fire. Right? And I look at groups like that. I look at other groups there were lots of religious groups that sprang up in the Western United States in the 19th century. Tons of them. Most of them didn't survive. Some of them did. Right? The Mormons are perhaps the most unusual of those that are still around. But it wasn't God gave me permission to talk to a rock. It was like, oh. So the Mormon church, everything that's wrong with every other church that makes it wrong is also wrong with the Mormon church. Okay. Is kind of where I got to. And the basis wasn't true anymore. Because I could only get, if I prayed to God, I felt good. And if I asked God if the Mormon church was true, I felt good. But I got the same response from doing things that were totally wrong. And I had reached, I guess, the point where I wouldn't say, well, it's just Satan making me feel good to trick me. Because that's a place you could go.
Yes.
That could be a logical place. It's like, well, I prayed to a rock, I'm not praying to God, so then Satan can get in the way and he can trick me and make me feel good, because the best lie is one that looks like truth.
Yeah, Satan's the trump card, isn't he?
That's right. But I didn't go there. And then Christy had to do all of her own reading and her own research in the Mormon Church, and her issues were kind of tied back again to polygamy and to women and all the lies that Joseph Smith would tell to women to get them to have sex with him when they were still married to someone else. And
Well, my biggest issue was really the Mormon Church always claimed that everything fell on Joseph Smith. It either is true or isn't true based on Joseph Smith. Because either he is the prophet that restored basically the line from Christ of the correct church, or he didn't, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
he either is what he claims to be or he's a fraud. And so for me, I'm very, very much analytical. So praying or emotion on how I felt didn't really play into it. I literally took out basically pro-con lists and started making everything I could confirm true about Joseph Smith and everything I had been taught, and started making lists and where is the truth and where does it lie. And finally the list of what I had been taught was so infactual compared to what I could confirm in the world around me. Had Joseph Smith been arrested for this? Was he a con man previously? You know, all of these things started adding up to where it just was, Joseph Smith is not who he claimed to be. And for me, that's all I needed. At that point, nothing else in the church could be true then, because it all rested on him being the person who restored the true gospel of Christ. If he didn't do that, then nothing in the church matters. So that's really, so it did matter what he claimed to be in the polygamy and things, but it was more for me just, is he who he claims to be?
I have a question as well. These processes you went through seem to dispel belief in this particular church. In your case, in Joseph Smith, and in your case, the church in general compared to others. What about falling away from believing in a God or a deity in general?
One of the things that became really apparent to me very quickly when I started associating in an ex-Mormon type community, people that were raised Mormon never changed churches. I'm sure you could find someone somewhere, but as a general rule, because they're all raised from the time they're babies, that every other church is wrong, right? And so as soon as the Mormon church isn't true, you don't have something to fall on. People that are some sort of other Christian or faith and leave and join the Mormon church usually go to another faith. Now, so she has a cousin, for example. Him and his wife are fundamentalist Christians now, like Pentecostal, I think.
Yeah, they left him.
And they left the Mormon church, and now they're very excited about Jesus. And so it's not always true, but in general, because as soon as you can pick apart the Mormon church, you've picked apart everything else. And you don't have this background to fall onto. You don't have something like, oh, well, this other church was good, because you've always known it was bad. You would have to start kind of from scratch, discovering that this other church might be something good. There might be a God, or there might be, where you're left like without any kind of support in a religious standpoint.
I didn't necessarily believe that any Christianity was true at that point. I just kind of went, oh, well, then everything's up for question.
Yeah.
And so from there, I did do research, though. We spent, and together we did a lot. When we decided the Mormon church wasn't true, we did set out to find out whether we thought the Bible was true, whether Christianity was true. So we did go through all these steps. We did...
Yeah.
And more together than we did, because you were across the world when you were the Mormon. But we definitely did research later. But for me, it just was instantly then probably there's nothing.
Yeah. Well, and it's hard to make a case, right? Because if you don't have this automatic, well, if the Mormon church is true, then Jesus is still right. You don't have that as somebody that grew up Mormon. And so then how am I going to make a base for Jesus from scratch? And that's hard to do.
I'm intrigued by the it's like a dual narrative here of you. It's almost like the two of you together have had this whole life where I gather you've grown up in separate Mormon communities and then you've come together and then you've both been questioning from different viewpoints but reaching a similar conclusion. Which must, I just wonder, on the one hand, if you'd not met, would you have reached the same point? And also, coming to that conclusion together, how the heck did it make you both feel? Because if I'd suddenly looked around and thought, well, the last 20, 30, however long years of my life I'd been living a lie, I'd have been, I don't know, bitter, angry, sad, lost, I don't know.
It's lost, I think.
Yeah.
And it's hard because the Mormon church was so important to me. And I was so
But you both seem
sure it
very
was
together
right.
and relaxed about it and comfortable in your skin.
It's
now.
been a long
It's been
time.
a long time.
Now. I think actually, ironically, I think he was a more practicing Mormon. I think he was more committed to the religion than I was. I think I actually had a harder time when we decided to leave. Because when he told me that reaction is exactly what I had. I was like, "You're crazy. This can't be." Because the second he said that, I felt like the blanket had been pulled out from underneath me. Everything that I had built my entire foundation on in life was gone, and I wasn't raised to think anything was as important as church. That is the paramount always. If you ask my dad what he wanted in life, it would be, so my kids are active Mormons. That's it. There's nothing else. I don't care. And so everything was like that. And I was like, so many people I would disappoint. So many. Plus, who am I if I'm not a Mormon? Like, what do I believe? What do I stand for? So for me, it was very, very scary.
Yeah.
Very scary.
That's kind of takes it back into people that we talked to that were still Mormon after we left. They were very concerned about, what are you going to do? Like, why are you not going to kill people? Or have
you have no morals.
You have
clearly.
nothing telling you what to do. And why would you not just kill people? Or do you
Yeah,
have
we
something
get
else
asked
now?
that
Have you
a lot.
found something else, some other books or something that tells you how to behave?
Yeah, we had Mormons knocking our door asking us questions like this. It was very odd. But I think at the same time what that did was when I came to the conclusion that I was okay and I had to go back to what I was before I knew I was. Like, you don't know what Mormon means when you're a little kid. What did I love before that? What did I like? What do I enjoy doing in life? What could I build my life around? Then I realized how many possibilities there were. To me, that just like blew open a door like I don't think most people in life really experience. I was like, anything I want. I could be anybody. I could do anything. And I felt like there was an enormous amount of information out there to discover and research and possibilities of who I could become.
So when you eventually left, is that you and Mormons done? Are you outside the community you grew up in now forever, or is there a connection?
So that happens. Some people get very, very isolated because, and I've seen marriages split over leaving Mormon church as well. And I've seen people leave together, and I've seen people, one Mormon person leaves and they stay together. I've seen all sorts. And in a sense, the community breaks, and we don't have really bad families. Our families aren't like, don't talk to my kids, don't come over. Nobody does that. But there's still a weird distance that's there all the time.
And they're still in the church.
Yes, and so she has a brother and a sister that are not, and I have an older brother that is not. And so he left, and her younger brother and younger sister for very different reasons. It was never, I'm going to study, I'm going to learn about this church. It was never a deliberate thing. It was just more like, I don't like that, I'm not going to do it. Yeah. And
Church is boring,
my older
I wanna
brother
rebel.
did it kind of like, I don't like that, I don't want to do it, I want to do other things. So things that I would have looked down on as an active Mormon was like, oh, you just want to drink and smoke. You're a bad person. Right?
That's a Jack Mormon, isn't it?
Yes. And
Yes,
so
that's
my
exactly
older brother
right,
kind
yeah.
of did that. He was away from the church and then later came back and did a lot of reading and research. And he's like, there are things that I don't agree with that he believes very different. And for us to be active Mormons and then research our way out is not that unusual, but it's different than other people that we know that aren't in the church. Or
But
that
they're
are
not
tied
quite
to
like
it.
Amish or something. We're not like shunned. We are
No.
allowed to speak or associate with people in the Mormon church, that kind of thing.
There are
But there's
weird things.
Because I remember you
Very
talking, I remember
different.
the first time I met you, you were talking about having to go through a formal process.
Yes, we
Yeah,
did
would
go
you
through a
be able
formal
to talk
process.
about that?
Yeah, so there were
and that could just be an option. You have.
There were lawsuits a while back and court cases because about people trying to leave the Mormon church, and eventually the lawyers figured out it was better just to let people exercise their right to not be a member anymore. And so for a while they were like, you can't leave, and then if you want to leave, we're going to excommunicate you. And so you're an apostate, you're going to hell, you're excommunicated. And now there's a process called name removal, and the church has decided that's fine. We won't excommunicate you for wanting to leave. You can just have your name removed from the rolls of the church. And what you have to do that is you have to write a letter to your religious leader explaining to them that you realize you're forfeiting your eternal soul. And,
You do. What is the wording? It is.
and that you want your
Something very
name
similar.
removed from the rolls of the church.
Yes, it is very similar. What is the wording that you use?
It's something like that. And what they do is they take, every member has a membership record. They keep track of every event in your life, when you were baptized, where you were born, your next of kin, all of it in a record. And they mark it as name removed at member's request, and they send it to a vault at headquarters, and it goes in there, right? And so your name's not really removed, but you're just not a member of record anymore. And that's how they sorted it out legally. If you don't do that, your membership record follows you. And so we left after our membership record followed us to England. Because we're like, we didn't ask for that. They're old volunteers, old people, they're serving a mission, they're serving Jesus. And they will take membership records and will call people on it. So if someone leaves a congregation area and they don't know where they went, they send their membership record back to church headquarters in Salt Lake. And there are people in Salt Lake that try to figure out where the person went by calling their next of kin, and so they can find out their address and send it to that congregation. And then that congregation now has that membership record, and they will try to contact that person to bring them back into the fold or into active life. And that's annoying.
That was one of the
And the
reasons
only
that
way
we
to not do
changed
that
it.
is to formally resign your membership.
Yes. That's one of the reasons we decided to formally, and just to make a
And
statement,
we
we
have
wanted to be
to-
able to say we're not Mormon.
Yeah.
When people that are Mormon would come up to us, they would say, oh, you are Mormon. No, you're just inactive. You're not attending. And we wanted to be like, we're not Mormon. So we wanted to be able to make that statement, I guess. So that's why we chose to do it that way. If you wanted to be Mormon again, like he was saying, it's undone everything that they kept track of in our life. So like when you're a baby, your father blesses you with a name. I don't have that any longer. The church doesn't recognize that. My baptism is undone, so I would have to be rebaptized. My marriage is not and void according to
We're not married
the Mormon
anymore.
church. We're not married because we were married in their facility, so that's not, and yeah, we'd have to redo that ceremony. So we would have to go, you could re-enter the Mormon church, but it is quite difficult. You would have to go through a lot of steps, and you would have to prove a lot before they would allow you to do them anyway. It would take years to get back to where we were.